What does it all mean? It's about understanding.
We are MythVision. Welcome to today's show. I've been deeply fascinated the last few months reading about Stoicism and the creation of Christianity. And I know how you all love to hear about how that happened. Red and I have brought on Professor Stephen Brown to help us understand what ancient Stoicism is and how it has influenced modern psychology. This is going to lead to some interesting conversation, so stick around. Keep up to date on our episodes by subscribing to our channel, hitting the like button, donating to our hosts on Patreon so we can upgrade and continue to bring you the best authors and scholars of mythology and the related subjects so that we can grow in our understanding of the universe. Stephen Brown is currently working as an instructor of psychology at Red Deer College. He has a PhD in cognitive psychology from the University of Amsterdam. He did a postdoc in the field of health psychology. His PhD research focused on a small brainstem nucleus called the locus ceruleus. You have to correct me if I say that wrong.
Nope, got it.
Which is important for attention and vigilance. His postdoc focused on heart rate variability and psychosocial stress. He is teaching introductory psychology as well as more advanced courses on the brain, sensation and perception, and statistics. On the side, Stephen has read over 30 books on Stoicism, but also reviews fountain pens on YouTube. Today, he is going to give us a presentation on Stoicism and how it has affected modern psychology. And towards the end of today's show, we'll discuss how Stoicism influenced the beginning of Christianity in Rome. I met Stephen at my friend Phil's house at a Call to Question event. And he's actually going to be one of my professors in a few weeks when I start at Red Deer College myself, which is good. This is Rhett.
Hey, nice to finally be on the show with you guys.
Yeah. And with that said, why don't you take it away, Stephen, and we'll let you know if we have any questions.
Sure, sounds good. It's fun to be here. What makes this interesting is that although I am a psychologist and although I teach psychology, I'm not a philosopher, so Stoicism is really something that has my personal interest, but it's not something that I teach at the college or anything. So I should probably say, for liability reasons, these are my views, not necessarily the college's views, but it's just something I find really interesting. So I take a sip, and then I shall talk to you a little bit about Stoicism. So Stoicism is it's a Hellenistic school of philosophy, right? And that means it's from ancient Greece. And sort of the anecdote that people always tell of the beginning of Stoicism is that there was a gentleman called Zeno of Citium. Citium is something that was a city that's on what is now Cyprus. And he was transporting a very precious cargo. He was a merchant, and his ship sank, which is a shame. So he lost everything he owned, and then he made his way to Athens. And as a destitute and now poor man, he made it to a bookstore, because what else do you do when you lost your way, right? So he made it to a bookstore. He picked up one of the books, actually scrolls, right, at the time. And it turns out that was Xenophon's Memorabilia, one of the books with sort of memories of Socrates. So he starts to read that. He finds that interesting. His dad was known to have already brought him a couple of philosophy scrolls when he was younger. He found that interesting, and so Zeno talks to the bookshop owner, and he says, "This is fascinating stuff, this philosophy. Where can I find one of these philosophers?" So the bookshop owner kind of looks around and says, "Oh, there's one. Follow that guy." So Zeno does that, and it turns out that that guy was Crates of Thebes. And Crates of Thebes was a Cynic philosopher, so someone from the school of cynicism, right? Another Hellenistic school of philosophy. And Zeno starts to study with that specific philosopher. And Zeno, actually, to be fair, Zeno shops around a little bit. He goes to a few other schools of philosophy as well. And he learns stuff here and there. And at some point, he decides that it's the time is right, and it's time for him to start his own school of philosophy. Now, something that I've always found very interesting about that moment is that many of the schools of philosophy in that time had their own buildings, Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum, or the Garden of Epicurus. These were actual buildings or areas where philosophers would teach about their school of philosophy. But Zeno makes a very interesting choice. He chooses to start teaching in a stoa. A stoa is a sort of a colonnade, a porch close to the market, a market in Athens. That actual stoa is now destroyed. But in any case, it was called the Stoa Picili. Picili means painted because it had, I think, war scenes, frescoes of war scenes on it. And the fun thing about this, the relevant thing about that, is that Zeno makes himself accessible to the public, right? He doesn't have a little school building where you have to get in and there's not a threshold. You can just go to the market, you run into Zeno, and Zeno stands there walking around vigorously, which apparently he did, and talking about all sorts of things. So he makes himself very available to the public, which I think is very nice. And he starts to teach, and at first his followers are known as Zenonians, just like you have Aristotelians, for example, or the Epicureans, Zenonians, and he later rejects that name. And I'll come back to why exactly, but it boils down to this, and we can expand a bit on that. But Stoicism is a sort of a virtue ethics type of philosophy. I'll explain that in a sec. But what a Stoic tries to do is emulate a sage. That's their sort of paradigm of literally a wise man, but I think it's a good idea to try and use gender-neutral language, so a sage, right? And his students ask him, "Are you a sage?" And Zeno says, "No, I'm not. So you probably shouldn't call yourself Zenonian, you should call yourself something else, because I'm not the one to emulate here," right? So given that he's teaching in the Stoa, they start to be referred to as the Stoics, right? The people of the porch. And that's where they got the name. Now, something to understand is that at this point in time, this is about 2,300 years ago, right? So at that point in time, there's no such thing as, say, a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So if you have problems in your life, you can't go to a therapist to talk about that, because psychotherapy has not yet been invented. But what you can do is go to a philosopher. And actually, in that day and age, philosophers kind of had the role, in a way, of what today we would call a therapist. So you could go to a philosopher and you could learn about how best to approach life. Now, of course, depending on the school of thought that philosopher belongs to, that philosopher will give you specific advice, which will vary depending on the school. Different schools would have different approaches to life. Epicureans would kind of emphasize the pleasurable, the hedonistic things in life. Stoics were kind of the other end of the spectrum in that regard. But you can go to a philosopher, you can learn about a philosophy of life, a way to approach life. And Zeno does just that. He starts to teach philosophy, his personal type of philosophy, and people start to listen, and people also start to kind of send their kids to study with him and learn his way of philosophy. And people start to study that stuff. Now, what does that exactly mean when you say, well, you study that? Well, there's a couple of things. Stoicism is traditionally split up into three branches, three things that you would study, three aspects of a curriculum. And in I would say no particular order as far as I'm concerned, but there was logic, and then there was physics, and there was Stoic ethics. Now, those three things you could easily have separate podcasts on each of these. So in a nutshell, Stoic logic taught about logical reasoning, logically valid reasoning. What is a valid way of arguing, and what is a not so valid way of arguing? At that time, because the Stoics absolutely did not invent formal logic, at that time, very common was Aristotelian logic. And if you study formal logic, and then you'll be very quickly exposed to something we call a syllogism. A syllogism is just a type of reasoning. You have a few premises, and from those premises follows a conclusion. A conclusion will either be logically valid or will not be logically valid. A famous Aristotelian syllogism, which has kind of been used to death. So this is kind of, in my mind, the prostitute of syllogisms. But in any case, this so used so often, but I'll say it anyway, is the example of all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Well, that's very valid reasoning. There's no way to argue with that. If you put the premises in that way, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, then logically it must be valid that Socrates is also mortal. Right? That would be a categorical syllogism. In other words, an Aristotelian syllogism. Now the Stoics kind of expand a bit on that whole logic, and they introduce something called the conditional syllogism. Whereas a categorical syllogism starts with something like all men or every man or some men. Conditional syllogisms start typically with something like if. So I could say something like, if it rains, then I get wet. It rains, conclusion, therefore I get wet. That's logically valid. The conditional syllogism. You can also flip that around just to see the fun of logic. If it rains, then I get wet, therefore it rains. Now all of a sudden this is not logically valid anymore. Now you're talking about a fallacy, because when you think about it, all kinds of things could have made you wet. Could have fallen into a ditch, someone could have thrown a cup of water in your face, it doesn't matter, but all kinds of things could have made you wet. So this is one part of what the Stoics would teach. Logic so that you can learn how to properly reason, what a proper argument is, and what a proper argument is not, right? The second aspect of the Stoic curriculum would be Stoic physics. Now, Stoic physics are incredibly complicated, but especially for my experience here tonight, I read up on it a bit more just to make sure that I actually knew what I was talking about. I've always found Stoic physics to be rather complicated, but in a nutshell, you could say Stoic physics looks at the universe, type of cosmological reasoning, and kind of what the Stoics say is, well, you know, when you look at the cosmos, then the cosmos kind of consists of a few things. There is an active component and there is a passive component to the universe. The passive component is matter. That matter is acted on, but it doesn't really do any acting itself. And then there is an active component, and that active component does do the acting. Now, Stoics would kind of equate that active component they have with different things. Sometimes they call it nature, sometimes they call it the cosmos, sometimes they call it the logos, and sometimes they call it God. So I think that's one of the appealing things of Stoicism. It doesn't really matter what you are, whether you believe in God or don't believe in God. You can use all kinds of terms to refer to this active component of the cosmos that does, well, in a way, I suppose, creation, but it is there. Another thing that's very interesting is that the Stoics say, actually humans are the same. So humans have a passive component and they have an active component. That passive component is the matter you're made up of, and then there is an active component, and that active component, they would say is your soul, right? Now, the fun thing is that, and I find that a very interesting image. The Stoics say your soul is actually part of the logos. They say there is the sort of the big cosmic logos, the sort of rational system that governs the whole cosmos. But then there is what they call the logos spermaticos. And spermaticos means exactly what it suggests. It means seminal, right? So they say your soul is actually a seed of that cosmic logos. So in a way, your soul is part of the cosmos. And I always found that a very interesting and fairly poetic way of looking at things. So there is that, right? That is part of physics. And then the other thing about the Stoic physics that I really enjoy is the idea of the conflagration. Conflagration is something the Stoics didn't invent either. They stole that from Heraclitus. And Heraclitus says, well, you know, every certain period of time, I believe he actually pinned it down to great years. The Stoics are a bit more vague about that, but they say at some point in time, the whole universe will go back to the one element from which it was created, and that is fire. And that means that after a certain amount of time has passed, the whole universe will burn up in a conflagration, like pyrosis in Greek. And everything gets destroyed. The whole universe kind of gets destroyed. Very, again, poetically, Cleanthes, the second head of the Stoa, describes how all the celestial bodies willingly throw themselves into the sun, kind of like moths being attracted to fire, because there is the Logos, this universal sort of ratio, which governs everything, which means that the whole universe is sort of a living sentient being, and so are all the celestial bodies. So they have a will, and they choose to throw themselves in the sun and a conflagration. And the only being that then survives that conflagration, the Stoics say, would be Zeus, the most important of the gods, who will then recreate the entire universe just the way it was, because Zeus is a perfect being. Perfect beings can only do things one way, the perfect way. So the whole universe gets recreated, is reborn. Everyone in that universe is reborn. And you will lead out exactly the same life that you have led out now, because all of that is determined by Zeus, by the cosmos, by the Logos, whatever you want to call it. And there's only one way to do it. So when you think about that, sorry? Yeah, it is boring. You know, it is boring. It's also a really weird idea to have, that if that is true, and in a way there actually is a cosmological theory, like a modern, more scientific theory that actually says something of that nature, that the whole universe kind of, you know, a big bang, and then will kind of collapse on itself again. There'll be another creation of the universe, etc. So in a way, it's interesting. I think purely coincidental, but the Stoics said something similar. But it's interesting to have this idea of you will lead out that same life again and again and again, an eternal cycle. Right. It's kind of it kind of screws with your mind a bit when you think about that, because if that is true, what it would mean is that we have sat here before, maybe thousands of times, saying the exact same things, right? And when you just said that's boring, then you have said that thousands of times before at exactly the same point in time. So it's a really strange thing when you think about it, like that would happen. So it tends to mess with people's minds a bit. So now we have talked about logic and Stoic physics, and then the final thing that you could study in the Stoa was Stoic ethics. Stoic ethics is something that interests me a lot, because it deals kind of with how to approach life, how to live your life, and how to not live your life as in a prescribed sense, but live your life in such a way that you make the most out of that life. And it's always a bit confusing, because of course this day and age, if we say ethics, then we kind of think of interesting moral choices, like should euthanasia be legal, should it not be legal, etc. But in that time, in the time of the Stoics, ethics really was about a philosophy of life, how best to lead your life in such a way that you will lead they get the most out of life. I'll put it that way. And there's a term for that in Greek philosophy, eudaimonia, which a little tough to translate, but let's call that something like a rich and fulfilling life. So the goal in philosophy is how exactly can you lead that life? What do you need to do to have that and to not suffer, not feel bad? So that is the basic sort of we call that tripartite sort of union of the three branches of Stoicism, and there are all kinds of analogies the Stoics use. For example, they said, well, logic is actually a fence surrounding a field, and then you have a tree in there, which is physics, and then that will actually bring forth fruits, and those fruits are the Stoic ethics. That's a way to conceptualize it. There's multiple ways. They also compared it to animals, like the bones and the flesh, etc., or to an egg even, whatever. But in any case, three important branches that are interrelated. Now, when you talk about Stoicism, then typically we make a division into the early, the middle, and the late Stoa. The early Stoa, well, that would start with Zeno, who founded the school, obviously. The second head of the school was Cleanthes, and the third head of the school was Chrysippus. I'm not going to list every single name of the school, but I mean those are the three sort of the trio that really set up Stoicism. Especially Chrysippus, for example, was incredibly prolific as an author, wrote a lot. Really did his best to refute all the arguments against Stoicism that were raised by Epicureans and mainly by the skeptics. And so Chrysippus was very important, as was Cleanthes, but Chrysippus was such a prolific writer, which made him very, very interesting. Now, the problem with all these dudes is that whatever they wrote is destroyed. At best, we have a few fragments from their scrolls, but most of their stuff has been lost to the tooth of time, so to speak. So we don't really have much of their material. Fortunately, there were doxographers. Diogenes Laertius is one, Johannes Stobaeus was another. These were people who kind of wrote about important people. So it's a specific type of historian, the doxographer. And if you look at Diogenes Laertius, for example, he wrote 10 books called, I think, the Lives and Ideas of Eminent Philosophers. And although he was not a Stoic, when he wrote that, we assume all these scrolls were still available. So he kind of summarizes what all these different schools of thought actually were about. So he talks about Epicureanism, and he talks about Socrates, and he also talks about Stoicism. And he kind of summarizes that. I always have to be careful because, of course, Diogenes was not himself a Stoic, so maybe he misrepresented some stuff, maybe he didn't understand some stuff, maybe he deliberately misrepresented some stuff because it was not his school and he kind of wanted to make it look bad. So taking all those things into account, you have to be careful when you read something like that. But a lot of what we know about the early Stoa, we know from Diogenes Laertius. So then what do we know about the early Stoa? Well, he wrote quite a bit about it, but I think one important thing is that Stoicism kind of boils down to the proper use of reasoning. If you reason rationally, if you reason in such a way that your reasoning is kind of in unison with call it what you like, the universe or the logos, then you will do well. If you reason in such a way that you go against established nature, and we can expand a bit on that, then you will start to suffer. So one thing that's important to them is you have to live in harmony with that nature, with the logos, the cosmic logos. Another thing that's important is the detachment of externals. That'll come back to. So we have living in accordance with nature. Zeno actually famously summarized that as live consistently. That's pretty bad teaching because that is incredibly vague and hard to interpret. right? Live consistently. So it was his successor, Cleanthes, who actually said, yeah, what my man meant is live consistently with nature. Live in such a way that you do not try to go against the universe, kind of go along with what the universe put in your path, and you will be okay, right? So that's the early Stoa. Now, there's a couple more, but those are the three important players in the Stoa, the early one. Then we go into the middle Stoa. Now, the middle Stoa had some important people. Posidonius is a famous one. Posidonius was a brilliant mind who wrote about all sorts of things, ranging from philosophy to geography to astronomy to meteorology, pretty much everything, a polymath, we would say. But most of his writings are destroyed. So unfortunately, we again do not know a whole lot about the actual details of what Posidonius actually wrote. And then there was Panaetius. Panaetius also wrote a lot of interesting stuff. But again, same deal. Most of these people's writings are gone. So we run into a wee spot of trouble there. So typically, when people talk about Stoicism, they either base themselves on the work of doxographers like Diogenes Laertius, and that is how they say something about the early Stoa, and maybe a bit of the middle Stoa. But of course, at some point, Diogenes Laertius died, and the Stoa kind of continued to develop after his death. And that is not in what he wrote about, because he was dead, and people who are dead don't tend to write so much. So that's a bit of an issue, right?
That's true.
So that's a fact of life, right? You kind of retire when you die. So that's one point. But then you have the late Stoa, and in the late Stoa, things start to get a little interesting because we have a lot of writings from people from the late Stoa. So now we can finally refer to actually primary sources from actual Stoics, as opposed to people who are not necessarily Stoics, but who happen to be summarizing what they think Stoics actually meant, said, did, or etc. So who are you talking about in the late Stoa? 4 people, I would say. And the balance shifts now from ancient Greece to Rome. Now all of a sudden we're in Rome. Stoicism has made its way to Rome, and those 4 key players from the late Stoa are, in sort of chronological order, Gaius Musonius Rufus. Musonius Rufus was of the equestrian order, which means that he was sort of a knight. We would, in Europe, you'd call that a knight of Roman society. And he was a philosophy teacher, a very just sort of clear-cut philosophy teacher. That is what he did. And he had one problem. He didn't write anything down. But there were people who took note of what he said. And we do have a couple of his lectures, one would hope, recorded as verbatim as possible. But in any case, we have lectures that claim to be Musonius' lectures. And we have some fragments, little bits of sayings from Musonius. Better than nothing, right? Then we have a very important person for the late Stoa, Epictetus. And Epictetus, that means something like acquired, because Epictetus was a slave. But his master, who was actually one of the secretaries of Nero, the Emperor Nero, his master, the Nero, his master allowed him to study, to go out and go to school. And Epictetus chose to go to school with Musonius Rufus. So he starts to learn about philosophy, and specifically Stoic philosophy. And at some point, he becomes a freedman. He's no longer a slave, and he is allowed to establish his own school of philosophy, which at some point has to leave Rome because a Roman emperor kind of banished all philosophers from Rome. So he goes to Nicopolis, sort of in Greece, and he establishes a school there. So he teaches. Now, one interesting aspect of Epictetus is Epictetus also didn't write anything down, just like Musonius Rufus. But
I'm sorry, are you saying Epictetus or Epigesus?
Epictetus, it's Epictetus. That very Epictetus. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, the question that arises right now is, how can Kevin hold up a book of Epictetus if Epictetus didn't write anything down? Good question. Glad you asked. So the reason for that is that Epictetus actually had a student called Arrian. Arrian did incredibly well for himself, became a high-ranking Roman politician, but Arrian studied with Epictetus and thought, now this is some interesting stuff. So he starts to record the lectures of Epictetus. When I say record, I mean write down. In his own words, verbatim. He claims to have written down verbatim what the master Epictetus taught. Those writings are collected. Epictetus lectured in Greek, are recorded in Greek, are called diatrivae, so in other words, diatribes, and were later translated into Latin as dissertationes, and now in English they're called, I'm just pretending to be a snob by using all these foreign words, so in English they are called the discourses, right? Now we know, because of what people refer to, that there used to be 8 books, so again you should actually say 8 scrolls, but let's say 8 books of discourses, but we only have 4 left. 1, 2, 3, 4, what happened to 5 through 8, we don't know, which suggests that at some point, I think in the Middle Ages, these were 2 separate manuscripts, and one of those got lost somehow, right? So we have books 1 to 4. Arrian also created the book that Kevin was holding up, the Enchiridion. An Enchiridion, fascinating. A lot of these ancient Greek terms are hard to translate, but Enchiridion means something that you carry around. So in that regard, a handbook, which is why in English it's often referred to as the handbook or the manual. It goes a little further than that. Enchiridion also means something like something you have, like sort of figuratively you hold. So something you hold at the ready, like say a dagger to defend yourself. And that's a very apt title for that book, because it basically consists of aphorisms, sayings, short bits of text. Some are a little longer, but hardly ever are they more than a few pages. Usually they're quite short, kind of a distillation of the absolute core of what it was that Epictetus taught about. So Arrian wrote the discourses as Epictetus' full lectures, and he wrote the Enchiridion as sort of like here's an expurgated version, a quick summary, an abstract. If you want to learn about Stoicism, this is it. And that book became incredibly popular. It was carried around by a lot of famous people in history.
Was it this Enchiridion that was handed out to the Roman soldiers in the first century?
I'm pretty sure it was that. It was that. Yeah. Okay. Also because it is much shorter than the discourse. I mean, the discourses you really have to sit down for and read, because that's a few hundred pages. That's the books. Whereas the Enchiridion, if you do your best, you could read that in an hour and a half, right? Because it's a pretty short book, so you can easily refer to it. And because all of those teachings were also compressed into short, little, sort of easily digestible bits, it becomes very easy to memorize them, for example, which was beneficial to, I think, Roman soldiers, and I think that's beneficial to a lot of people. So I always recommend people to check out that book. Okay, so now we have Musonius Rufus, the knight who was a philosophy teacher. Then we have Epictetus, who was a slave and then became a philosophy teacher. And then we have the third important person with a name that I can't reproduce from the top of my head because he has no less than 5, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Philosophus Augustus, right? Indicating that he was an emperor with the nickname Philosophus. He actually had philosopher as a nickname. So now you have...
That must have been nice.
Sorry?
Oh, I said that must have been nice for him. So this was actually the Roman emperor, Augustus?
This was actually the Roman emperor, not the Emperor Augustus. This was the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Yeah.
Oh.
So if you've seen Gladiator, you remember that old emperor that gets strangled to death by his own son at the opening. That was Marcus Aurelius. In real life, he didn't get strangled to death by his son. That was an interesting play of history. But that was Marcus Aurelius, who also kind of with a wink to his real life asks Maximus, how will I be remembered as Marcus the warrior, Marcus the philosopher? And that was the answer. Yes, the philosopher is how he became known in history. So you have a philosopher teacher, you have a slave, and you also have an emperor. And the emperor of Rome, he lived 121 to 180 AD. His life we can like pin down pretty well chronologically because he was a Roman emperor. So there's a lot of people who wrote about him. He was the most powerful man in the world. The Roman emperor at that point in time was the most powerful man, the biggest army, the most powerful army, the biggest like huge surface of land. So a very important person. Marcus Aurelius was from a young age attracted to philosophy and was actually given by one of his teachers a copy of the discourses of Epictetus, and also describes that in the Meditations. He talks about this. So Marcus wrote, thank God we have a philosopher who actually wrote himself and did not, had someone write down his stuff or something, right? So Marcus wrote. Now, he never intended that book to be published. It was more like a diary. In Greek, it's called, he wrote in Greek, the language of philosophy, interesting for a Roman emperor who would have spoken Latin, right? But Greek was the language of philosophy. He wrote a book entitled To Himself. So it wasn't sort of like a diary where he does sort of philosophical exercises to make himself think about things. And that book we have, and it's now known in the West typically as the Meditations. At some point, someone decided to give that the title Meditations, and that's what stuck. Meditations are not easy to read. In fact, some of them are incomprehensible because he wrote to himself, so we don't know what he has weird stuff like the filth of a pig, and that's an entire chapter, and you're like, I don't know what this means, right? But then there are other things, of course, that had meaning to him. And there are other things where he kind of expounds his whole philosophical ideas, which were, in fact, very Stoic, given that he was exposed to Epictetus and was actually taught by a Stoic tutor. So they had a lot of philosophical thoughts that were very much based on Stoicism. Okay, then the final person to talk about, and then we can get to sort of the nitty-gritty of Stoic ethics. The final person was Lucius Annius Seneca. Seneca the younger, there's also a Seneca the older, then obviously, but Seneca the younger was a bit of everything. He was a playwright, he wrote interesting plays, he was an orator, he spoke in public and such. He was also a sort of a what do you call that, like a guardian to the Emperor Nero, supposed to be sort of a tutor to the Emperor Nero. And Nero was nuts, right? As we know, Nero was a bit insane. So in the end, Seneca is forced to commit suicide by Nero, and we lose Seneca. But Seneca had written a lot. Seneca wrote a lot of things, not just plays. But one of the very interesting things that Seneca wrote is a set of letters, moral letters, we say, and those letters he wrote to a person that we were actually not sure if that person really existed, but Seneca writes about philosophy to this person. He writes about his philosophy, and which is Stoic philosophy, and he writes about how that person should handle specific things that happen in his life, that he how to handle that, what to do, what not to do, how to think about things, etc. And in that regard, I would say that Seneca probably was the most prolific Stoic author because he wrote those letters. He also wrote a bunch of essays, moral essays on how to behave. So we have a lot of these things, and those texts are important texts for those people who do study Stoicism. So, okay, so we have Seneca, right? That's where we ended up. We have Seneca. Seneca wrote a lot. Seneca is an important source of information. Right. Now we have all the basics. We know how Stoicism started. We know a little bit about the physics. We know a little bit about the logic. We know about the big players. Then I think the real question is, how does Stoicism work, right? Like, what exactly does it do, and what does it not do? Well, I think that you could say that Stoicism has two goals. One goal is living in accordance with nature, right? That's something that Zeno emphasized, and that Cleanthes, Chrysippus, that all those big guys emphasized. Marcus Aurelius does it constantly in his meditations. He consistently emphasizes just live in accordance with the universe, do what the universe wants you to do, you'll be fine, etc. So, absolutely nothing technical happened. So you have, we were talking about Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius, emperor, wrote a book, right? And I would say the final person, if you really want to talk chronologically, that actually came before Marcus Aurelius. But the final of these four great Roman Stoics of the late Stoa, that final person would be Seneca, Lucius Annaeus Seneca, aka Seneca the Younger. Seneca the Younger was all sorts of things. He dabbled in I don't know what you call that, amateur politics or something, because he was an advisor to Nero, same Emperor Nero that we all know as a very interesting person. Nero derailed more and more throughout his life, and in the end forced Seneca to commit suicide in not the most pleasant of manners. So Nero was definitely interesting, but Seneca wrote a lot. Seneca was also a playwright. Seneca wrote a number of moral essays, a very interesting one called De Ira, on anger, De Tranquilitate, I think is another one, on tranquility, I want to say. In any case, he has written a number of these essays, De Constantia, on constancy, so very interesting about how to, for lack of a better word, keep your cool. And a lot of these, we think, were kind of focused at Nero. Were kind of like implicit ways to give it to his pupil and say, here, read this. This is about how not to lose your stuff, and actually came to him. Maybe you should read. And of course it didn't work, because in the end Nero forced him to kill himself anyway. But very interesting. Another thing that's quite interesting is that Seneca wrote a whole set of letters, epistolae moralis, and these letters, a couple over 100, he wrote quite a lot, to a person that may have been real, may also have not been real, we're not 100% sure. In any case, he kind of expounds his philosophy, which is quite Stoic, although he also quotes Epicurus a lot and says, I know he's from the enemy camp, but it's also good to kind of look at what other people are saying, which is an interesting thought. So maybe it's a slightly sort of eclectic Stoicism, but in any case, there's a lot of Stoic thought in those letters, so people who study Stoicism typically find those letters quite interesting, because he explains to this person, I think it was Lucilius, how to live. What do you do when this happens? Dear Lucilius, you told me about that this person, you lost a friend. Well, let me tell you about how, etc. And then you get sort of reasoning about how a Stoic would handle that sort of situation. So quite interesting. One comment on Seneca is that he was pretty much a billionaire, because he was one of the first investment bankers, and he was very, very, very rich. And some people say, well, it's kind of easy to be all philosophical and tell people to be philosophical, but in reality you have so much money, right, not necessarily a completely fair way to then be a philosopher, but that's a whole different discussion. So I think the interesting question that then remains to us is how does Stoicism work, right? What exactly do you do if you say I am a Stoic? Then what does that mean? What do you really do? Well, in a nutshell, I think there are two important things, two important aspects of Stoicism. On the one hand, you have detachment of the externals, external things that can happen to you. And then you have the desire to live in harmony with nature, something that Zeno already said, live consistently, something that Cleanthes, the second head, turned into live consistently with nature, live in harmony with nature. Nature being the cosmos, ratio, the logos, God, whatever you like to call that. As I said before, that logos is taken to be an active force in the universe. You can also call it fate if you want. And that will put a whole bunch of things on your path. And you can choose to go along with those things, or you can choose to go against them and rebel against them. And Stoics would say, well, if you do that, if you go against it, you won't be happy. So the ancient Greeks, as I said before, they had a word for this, evdaimonia, this sort of rich and fulfilling life. And one of the goals of Stoicism, through these two basic goals, right? Detachment of externals, from externals, and to live in harmony with nature, is to lead that rich and happy life. Now, the question is, then how do you do that? Because that's still very vague. I mean, live in harmony with nature can kind of suggest that you throw off your clothes and start hugging trees, but that is not at all what Stoics meant by that term. So Stoics would say, you could say there are three disciplines. You can practice, or you should practice, virtue. Stoic ethics, that's what I'm talking about now, how to live your life according to the Stoics. Stoic ethics are a type of virtue ethics. There are other schools in Hellenistic philosophy that also were virtue ethics. And Stoicism is one. And so that means that the Stoics say there are two things in life, virtue and vice. If you choose the path of vice, you will suffer, you'll never feel good. If you choose the path of virtue, you will feel well, you'll feel good, you'll be a happy person. And in between these two things, traditionally is nothing, except the Stoics modified that idea a little bit, because the idea of virtue versus vice, you will find in a lot of Hellenistic schools. The Stoics modified that a little bit, and we'll come back to that in just a second. So how do you do this? How are you virtuous? Well, that is a very interesting, very complicated question. The Stoics pretty much say, well, virtue consists of four things. Practical wisdom, meaning knowing what to do, making the right choices, right? Wisdom. Then there is courage. You can know what the right thing to do is, but you also have to do it, right? And that's not always easy. So that would be courage, not just in battle, but also in your everyday life, doing the right thing. Then there is justice, which is more of a societal thing than a real individualistic thing. The society needs justice. If you commit a crime, you will be punished. And we have said in our society, then that is justice, right? And finally, there is temperance, maybe slightly archaic term, but temperance means something like everything in moderation. You shouldn't do things. You shouldn't do too much of a thing, but you shouldn't do too little of a thing either, right? You should do.
What is it? What is it?
Temperance.
Temperance.
Yes, temperance. And again, you can also just call that moderation, right? Everything in the right proportion, right? I always struggle with that in the face of chocolate. I mean, there's, you can have too much of it, right? And then it's not a good thing anymore. So everything in moderation, and as Oscar Wilde added to that, everything in moderation, including moderation.
And they're called the cardinal points?
Yes, the cardinal virtues, because these are also, I would say, largely accepted in Catholicism, for example, in the Middle Ages. But there is always a little bit of debate, because you can also add some to these, or you could take away from these. Some people say there are 7 cardinal virtues, some say there are 5, some say there are 4. This is pretty consistent with Stoicism, but of course you could come up with some others. I mean, for example, Something that is sometimes added to this is filial piety, right? The duties you have towards your parents. You can debate whether all of these should be virtues, but I mean that is something you could add to it, and that is also something that Epictetus advocates. For example, he does talk about how you should, and so does Rufus, by the way, how you should conduct towards your conduct towards your parents. But anyway, so I would say those four are decent. Yes.
Do you remember that movie Warriors of Virtue with the kangaroos?
Yes.
And I wonder if they got some of their ideas from Stoicism then.
It's possible. I mean, it's something that when you start to think about it, I think that you see in a lot of different, let's call it pop cultural phenomena. I mean, Gene Roddenberry based Mr. Spock on the Stoics. That was supposed to be sort of like a representation of Stoicism. I think he didn't fully understand Stoicism, but the idea was that it would represent that aspect of human history and philosophical history. So you see that in a lot of contexts and movies, for example. Yeah.
What a great movie that was. It was like the furry Ninja Turtles.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So no, I mean, by all means, it's possible they were influenced. So, okay. Wisdom, courage, justice, temperance. But that is still pretty abstract, right? I don't think a lot of people wake up in the morning and say, today I'm going to be really just, or I'm going to do something really wise today, right? So that's actually pretty difficult. And also in my mind today. Yes, sir.
Just I have to ask, because I immediately think of the 4 cardinal signs of the zodiac, because I'm into astrotheology. And I think, this is, to me, it kind of fits the daily cycle, or even the religious calendar of the Jews, where it would be wisdom is spring, courage is summer, justice is fall with Libra, the scales of justice, and then you have temperance, where you need to be self-controlled because it's winter and you have to be careful what you're eating. So I don't know, I saw that before, but I just wanted to mention. Yeah.
Not only that, but not only that, but it's in Stoic. What is that? In Stoic physics, it all repeats. Well, that's a cycle of time too.
Yeah,
interesting.
So I'm always meditating on the cycles, which is the cosmos of Pythagoras, which would be the zodiac, and I'm seeing all the relationships. But we'll get into more of that at the end, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, okay. So we have this. We have we call it cardinal virtues, all aspects of virtue that you should strive towards. But then, how do you do it? How do you do all this? Well, often we make sort of a separation into 3 things. There is desire, and there is action, and there is assent in Stoicism. So and again, all of this, what I'm saying now, is sort of in the service of living virtuously, right? Doing the right thing. How do you do that? How do you do those things in such a way that they are in harmony with nature? How do you do it? So let's first look at desire. A very famous aspect of Stoicism, so famous because it is the first chapter of the Enchiridion. Epictetus said or taught, and Arian wrote down, some things are within your control, other things are not within your control, which sounds like an incredibly obvious thing to say, but it is something that a lot of people forget about, right? Especially when a crisis hits. I always tell people that it's very easy to sort of sit drinking tea when everything is going right in your life, and in my case, maybe eating chocolate, but in any case, sitting and sort of saying you're a stoic and then everything, it's easy. When someone you love dies, or you fall ill, or something bad happens in your life, suddenly it's a bit tougher, right? To just say, oh, it's okay, it's in accordance with nature, it's fine. It's a lot more different. So it's an important point, I think, that Epictetus makes and stresses many times throughout the discourses, and also in the Enchiridion. Some things are within your control, other things are not within your control. And the Stoics, I don't think that they necessarily called it that, but later that became known as the dichotomy of control. And of course, this is kind of where wisdom comes in, because the real trick lies in finding out which things in your life are within your control and which things in life are not within your control, right? So, because this is something interesting. I deal, because of my job, with a lot of students, and sometimes when I talk about this, because I don't teach this stuff, but I sometimes try, to in sort of a mentor role, try to talk to students about this kind of stuff, and then sometimes that turns into, oh, okay. Well, then I don't have to study for tests anymore because I will pass or I won't pass, and it doesn't matter. It's outside of my control. That's not really what the Stoics say, right? They don't say you don't have to do anything because everything else. You have to learn what is within and what is outside your control. But once you have done something, then it's no longer in your control. And the famous analogy that is used is that of the Stoic archer. You can be an archer. You can be trained in firing arrows from a bow, right? And you can be a really good sort of like a sniper archer and be really good and really know how to hit a moving target and all that. You can aim. You can try to take the wind into account and all that stuff. And that is all within your control. Your intention is completely within your control. But once you let go of the arrow, it's out of your control, right? Now, the wind can come in. Maybe some animal will run past it. Something will happen to the arrow. All of that is outside of your control. So if you want to be a hardcore Stoic, then what you would say is your intentions are within your control. You can always choose to do something or choose to not do something, choose to do the right and virtuous thing, or choose to do something that goes down the path of vice. That's your choice, right? Mm-hmm. So that is a sort of aspect of desire. And the Stoics, for example, Epictetus, would take this a bit farther and say, so kind of what you should do is realize that if you seek to pursue certain things in life that are not within your control, then you'll probably be disappointed. For example, everybody wants to be a millionaire, but not everyone will be a millionaire. So if you make that a goal of life, that is not necessarily fully within your control. You can do things to maximize your chances of a good job and education, all that, but it's still not 100% within your control. So maybe that is not a realistic goal. And if you cling to that, you will start to be unhappy because you may not achieve that goal. And if you don't achieve that goal, you'll be unhappy, right? Because you didn't get what you wanted out of life. So if you set a different goal, something that you can attain, then it's okay. So a Stoic would say, nothing wrong with trying to be a millionaire. Stoics are not ascetics. But they might say, maybe the goal you should set yourself is, I will do everything that is within my control to become a millionaire. But then if I don't become a millionaire, that's okay too. I accept that that is how the universe put things in my path. And I think that's a pretty powerful way to look at life, because suddenly a lot of things are not so oppressive or depressing anymore. So that is one aspect, desire. Second aspect on how to lead a good life is that of action. And something that the Stoics introduced that I think is very interesting is the concept of the indifference. That is indifference ending in TS. So this is a noun, indifference. And to understand that, you kind of have to put things in context. And I have to simplify this a little bit, but in a nutshell, you could say, on the one hand, you have a school like the Cynics, right? Remember, it was Crates of Thebes, the Cynic, who taught Zeno initially. So a lot of these things that Zeno developed are a bit cynical in nature, right? Now the Cynics say, all you need for eudaimonia, for a good and rich and fulfilling life, is virtue. Everything else is a distraction. Wealth is a distraction. Having money is a distraction. Having a wife or a husband is a distraction. Having a good job or a good position in society is a distraction. all those things will distract from virtue. All you need is virtue. Do the right thing, you'll be fine, even if you're a beggar. And that's pretty much what they were. They owned their clothes and knapsack and a few things, but they didn't have much material possessions. So cynicism never really caught on. This was never really a popular thing, because once you tell people they shouldn't have any money, typically they don't really want to do it anymore, right? So that never really caught on. But important thing to remember here, cynicism is about virtue is all you need. Then on the other hand, you have people like the peripatetics, who would say something like, well, so this is Aristotelian, right? And again, I have to simplify a bit, but Aristotle takes this exactly the other direction. He says, no, look, virtue is indeed the most important thing, but to be completely happy, you also need other things. You will need good health. If you're sick, you can't be happy. You will need wealth. If you're not rich, or at least have enough money, you can't be happy. He even goes so far as to say you have to have physical beauty. In other words, if you're ugly, you can never be happy. Right? This is a pretty extreme viewpoint. But so they go the other way. It's not just virtue, it's virtue and a whole slew of other things that you need to have, and if you don't have those things in place, you won't be happy. And here is what I think the Stoics add to that, which I find really appealing. The Stoics say, virtue is the most important thing for a happy life. But there are other things in life that you don't have to avoid, like the cynics say. You also don't have to have, like the Aristotelians say, but you can have them. And we call those things indifference. And there are preferred indifference, and there are dispreferred indifference, which kind of sounds like a contradiction in terms. I mean, how can something be indifferent and preferred? Well, what that means is it is indifferent to virtue. If you have that thing, it won't do anything for your virtue. For example, I think a really good example is money. You can use money in a really good way to help other people and to help society, and then it's virtuous. But you can also use it in the most terrible way possible to hurt other people, to harm others. Then you use that money for vice, right? So the Stoics say there's nothing wrong with money, but there's nothing really good about it either. It is indifferent to virtue, and it depends on how you choose to use it. And then it is a preferred indifferent, because most people would rather be rich than poor. So it's something that you would rather have than not have, right? And then there are dispreferred indifference, things that you would rather not have than do have. For example, be sick. Nobody really wants to be sick. But if it happens to you, the Stoics would say, yeah, well, that's the will of the universe, the cosmos, the ratio, the logos, whatever. What do you expect? It just happened. It's okay. You can still be virtuous even when you are sick and when you are not physically beautiful, etc.
You know, Stephen, if I could stop you right there. Mm-hmm. This sounds very much like what Paul teaches in his epistles and his letters. Yes. Pretty much that all things are acceptable, but not all things are beneficial. Like it's like to God, and as far as God's concerned, it's indifferent to how God sees you, but they're not necessarily going to be beneficial for you, you know?
Yes.
So I can definitely see, and this is all, you know, before that's written. So I'm wondering how much the Bible was influenced by Stoicism.
Well, that's a very interesting question. At some point in history, it was claimed that there were actually letters exchanged between Paul and Seneca. Now, these turned out to be forgeries. However, if I'm not mistaken, Paul does mention, I want to say it was Seneca's brother, who actually was a politician at that time, and who is mentioned by Paul. Now, yeah, don't pin me down in this specific detail. I'm pretty sure it was Seneca's brother. In the most vague manner, I'll say I'm pretty sure it was Seneca's family member. But so that person is mentioned and was actually related to Seneca. So if you look at it from that perspective, it wouldn't be too great a leap of the imagination to say, well, that it's not unthinkable that some sort of influence occurred there, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's for sure an interesting parallel. Yeah, yeah.
Well, you can just hear it as you explain what Stoicism is and how it's practiced. It sounds very much a lot like my understanding of what Christianity should be, not what it is today, but what it should be. Yeah.
Yes.
What I found interesting was reading the Enchiridion. Like, it sticks out like almost all over the place how this just makes sense of a lot of the New Testament, even. And a lot of the philosophy. It just things start to click, and like it's like popcorn as you're reading through this thing, and it's like that's why I wanted to have this conversation on this. So
yeah, no, I think it's very interesting, and I'll just talk quickly about ascent, and then I think I can say the final thing about this, which is kind of rounds up my story, but I think that will be a very interesting segue if you want to talk about Christianity. So we have now talked about how to be a good person in the field of desire. So we have this dichotomy of control. Some things are within, some things are outside of your control. You can try to be a good person, a virtuous person through your actions, where you have to think in terms of indifference, right? A lot of things are indifferent to virtue. And the most important thing is virtue, being a good person, doing the right thing, the wise thing, the just thing, the courageous thing, the temperate thing. All of these things you have to do, right? And the Stoics actually take that very far and say an action. So it's interesting because they say there are indifference, right? But they also say when it comes to virtue, it is either virtue or vice. So either you are a completely virtuous person or you are sort of a viceful person, but there isn't really anything in between. You cannot be a little virtuous. You're either virtuous or you're not. That's interesting, I think. Now, the final thing the Stoics talk about is the concept of assent. And assent, so that's A-S-S-E-N-T, not like assent. Assent is a matter of thinking about your emotions. Okay? So the Stoics, a lot of people, I should say, who don't really know much about Stoicism have the preconception that Stoicism is about not having any emotions or not feeling any emotions. But that is not really true. When you read the Stoics, no Stoic says you shouldn't have any emotions. What Stoics do say is what you need is, in Greek, apatheia. And apatheia sounds a lot like apathy in English, and that's because the word apathy was derived from apatheia. And apatheia does not mean sitting around apathetically, not caring about anything. Apatheia means dealing with passions. Alpha, a, right? And then pathos, plural pathe, the passions. So basically, not passions, right? A type of, I think it's in their mind a matter of dealing with what happens to you in such a way that you are free from your passions. And the Stoics have a whole theory about the passions, good passions, bad passions, and these are the bad passions. But I think we can all kind of imagine what that means. I have never met anyone who said, I am too happy today. I'm just too happy, I can't handle it. You know, nobody says that. Nobody has issues with being happy. But people do have issues with being anxious. People do have issues with being frustrated or angry or depressed. And those types of negative passions can really influence your life, and not in a good way, right? As I started off saying 15 hours ago or something, Stoicism, to a large degree, is about helping people, right? There were no therapists at that point in time. So this whole practice of Stoicism, to a degree, was about what can we teach people so that they get along better in life. In fact, the whole process of using philosophical exercises to lead a good life, to, for example, deal with your passions, in Greek is called therapia, right? Obvious link to our word therapy. That's what these kinds of schools of philosophy were about. So now we ended up with ascent and dealing with your passions. Now, what does a Stoic say in that regard? Well, Stoics would say something like, Marcus Aurelius is clear. Epictetus is very clear. Stoics say, I think, two things that are relevant in this context. The first is, it's not the thing itself that bothers you, but it's your thoughts about it, right? If you lose your job, yeah, that's unpleasant. But that's it. It's not terrible, horrible, awful, unbearable. It's none of these things. It is an inconvenience. Nobody wants this, but you can probably survive, right? All of us here right now are still alive. So apparently we made it through life far enough in the face of some adversity. We still managed. So Stoics would say, yeah, but what really matters here is not everything that has happened to you, it's how you think about it. And to tie this in with things we talked about earlier, you know what you're always in control of? Your thoughts. You can choose what to think about something, even when it's difficult. And I'm not saying it's always easy. And I'm also not saying that if tomorrow I would lose my job, I would jump around happily and say, I'm a Stoic, I'm fine. That's not really how it works. But what you can think is, well, what does this really mean? Well, I can start looking for a new job. That's within my control. Finding a job is not. Looking for a job is. So if I set myself the goal, I will immediately look for a new job. How can I be disappointed? I'm looking for that job. I can do it when my boss fires me. If my boss fires me, I can walk out of her office and already be on my phone looking for other jobs. Right? That is within my control. And that's not a bad thing. So again, it's not the thing that bothers you. It's how you think about it. The second thing Stoics would say, and that ties in very well with some modern psychology, right? Something the Stoics say is, when you experience an emotion, especially when that is a negative emotion, right? You can take a step back. In modern psychological parlance, we call it cognitive distancing. You can take a step back and you can ask yourself rationally, is what I feel really necessary? Like, for example, I'm making this up on the spot, but this happens a lot, for example, in marriages or in relationships, romantic relationships. You expect something from your partner, but you don't actually communicate that desire to your partner. So then you start to think things like, well, she never does the dishes. I always have to clean the kitchen. It's completely normal that she would do that once in a while, but she doesn't, and then you get angry, right? This is not an autobiographical experience, I stress, but I mean, I'm just like putting it out there, right? This could happen.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right? But I mean, but everybody has these kinds of thoughts. Like, I wish he or he would do this or this and that, but they don't. And then you start to feel bad. Now, the Stoic would say, that would be an example of therapia, would be take that step back and think, well, did I tell my partner? Because if I did not, how could I expect him or her to know that that is what I expect? And is this really something to get this upset about? The Stoic answer is, I would say 99% of the time, no, it's not. It's probably not worth getting that upset about. And thus you can sort of reason yourself out of this. Now that sounds, sometimes when I tell people this, they say, yeah, that's really easy to say. You just change your thoughts and then you change your behavior. Now my answer is, yeah, because it is. It is that easy. Yeah. You're in charge of your thoughts, but you just don't do it because a lot of people don't, right? They don't. That's not a criticism. It's just that sometimes you require a bit of training to start doing that.
You know, Stephen, on that, I found, like, in my life, even when I'm sick and I have to go to work or something, but I'm sick, unless it's like something contagious, I want to stay home initially. But if I tell myself, you know what, go to work, you'll probably feel better throughout the day. It's just like the way you think about sickness can literally make you more sick because you're just like leaning into it. Or you kind of like pretend like you're not sick and then your body's like, oh, well, I guess he's not sick. It's really interesting how it can change even your reality.
I think so. And that was, I fully agree. And that is something that this particular thought, right, this concept of it's not about what happens to you, but it's about how you think about it, was actually the basis for Albert Ellis, he passed away now, but this is a psychologist from like within living memory. He passed away in the 2000s, who founded a psychological therapy called rational emotive behavioral therapy, REBT, which in itself then kind of formed the basis for cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a pretty well-known type of therapy. And that therapy was based to a large degree on this concept of it's not the thing that bothers you, it's how you think about it. And if you can change your thoughts, then you may start to feel a lot better. And so that's where we got, for example, this term of cognitive distancing. That's a cognitive behavioral term. So I agree with you, Rhett. It can really make a big difference. And you see that, for example, in people who are depressed. Now, I want to emphasize, so I'm not saying that if you are very depressed, all you need to do is change how you think, and then like this, you'll feel better. That's a bit simplified. If you really have a severe depression, you cannot just talk yourself out of it. But what you see in people with depression is that it's a vicious cycle. At some point, you wake up and you think, why would I even get out of bed? There's nothing to live for anyway. Things get worse and worse and worse. You don't leave the house anymore. That reinforces that everything is terrible. Then you start to lose your friends. That's really bad.
Yeah.
And of course, you may require medication to help you get over that. Of course, I'm not saying you're not. But if you look at the type of therapy that people like that would get, people with depression would get, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, to a very large degree, depends on changing the patterns of thought, right? And that, again, that was based on Stoic thought.
Now, Stephen, are you aware that Jesus in the Bible says, as a man believes, so he will be? And
I was not aware of that. That's
a very Stoic thing to say.
Yeah, I would say so.
And Paul writes, it talks about taking every thought captive.
Yes.
And so that's just, it falls right back in line.
That's the whole.
Go ahead.
That's the whole battle. That's like 2 Corinthians chapter 10 or something. But I did actually a short study on how the last Armageddon is fulfilled. We have all these futurists thinking that there's going to be a war in this valley in whatever, Jerusalem or something. Well, but I began to realize that the war in the New Testament is talking spiritually about taking every thought captive, and you're bringing down the strongholds of lies, because it's the father of lies versus Jesus, who says, I am truth. And then you overcome that by understanding. And then you're fully established in the new covenant. And it says in the new covenant, they shall no longer teach their neighbor, or they shall know me.
Yep.
It's all there. It's like,
yeah, man. I mean, it's beautiful. It really is. To me, the gospel is that. I mean, this is the gospel. Stoicism. I'm writing notes. This letter. No.
Yes.
No, and it's like, I think I just want to raise that awareness in our viewers about what Stoicism is, so that they can see some of this stuff too. That's like what I'm excited about, even for my personal life. But
I think it makes a lot of sense. I don't know if this makes a lot of noise. Sorry, I'm just leafing through one thing here, because I think the final thing to kind of discuss here, and I think that will be a good segue into what you're talking about, is, so how do you put all this into practice, and what should you strive to be if you say I am a Stoic, or I want to try to be a Stoic? So we've now talked about a lot of things, right? So there is Stoicism, there is the logic and the physics and the ethics. We've talked the past while was about Stoic ethics and desire, action, assent, how to deal with your emotions, because you can choose, the Stoics say, you can choose to give your emotions assent, right? That was the final point I was trying to make. You can choose by rationally thinking about things is this something worth getting angry over, right? Which you could summarize as pick your battles. Is this really worth my time? And the Stoics would say, sometimes, yes. Sometimes you have an absolute right to do get angry. Not a lot of the time, but there may be issues where you do have the right to feel that passion. But how do you do it? So if you want to lead this life of eudaimonia, I think I have tried to go from the theory to making it more and more concrete, right? So you have eudaimonia, rich and fulfilling life, and you have virtue. And virtue we've broken up. There is wisdom, courage, justice, and there is temperance. And then we have kind of broken that down even further and said, well, you have sort of your control over your desires. Don't want things that are not within your control. Don't try to avoid things that are not within your control, because you will not come out on top in life if you do that. You have your actions, so you have virtue, which you should always strive for. You have vice, which you should avoid at all costs. And then you have the indifference, which take up that special space right in between, indifferent to virtue. And then finally, you have your assent to emotions. Okay, now, how do you actually put that into practice? Well, a very important concept to the Stoics is that of what is called in Greek the sophos, a wise man, which for the record is not necessarily a Stoic concept. There are many schools of Hellenistic thought that say you should try to imitate the wise man. And again, because I think it's nice to use gender-neutral language, you could call that the sage, someone who is truly wise. Well then, who is truly wise? Well, the Stoics have a slightly disturbing answer to that question. They say, well, Socrates was pretty wise. He's probably a good sage. Epictetus actually mentions with much love and adoration, which is interesting, Diogenes the Cynic. It was Diogenes of that the famous anecdote. Diogenes got visited by Alexander the Great, and Diogenes, being a cynic, lived in this sort of, I think it was a wine jug or something. It was, the cynics were all a bit peculiar in that regard, but they were kind of ascetic. And Alexander talks to him and he says, well, I am Alexander the Great. I hear you're a pretty good philosopher who doesn't really want anything in his life. So tell me, is there anything at all that I can give you? And Diogenes says, yeah, you can step out of the sun for a second. So it's, I think that's a good way to look at things, right? The cynics were very much about that. So Epictetus mentions Diogenes the Cynic as a model to emulate. In fact, he tells his students, most of you are not even Stoics, let alone that you would be a cynic. So in other words, to be a cynic, you've got to be really hardcore, right? Because you kind of have money, where you kind of bring a possession. So, it's pretty tough stuff. So you are a sage. Now, what is the second and final part of this, the surprising answer that Stoics would give if you would ask them who's a sage? They would say, well, not you, and also not me, because all of us, unfortunately, we're not sages. In fact, they go further. They say we're fools or slaves. None of us actually are truly wise, enlightened people. Now, that is very humble, and that was a reason for Zeno to say, we shouldn't call this school Zenonians, because I'm not a sage, so it would be kind of weird to call it that. Let's call it Stoics. It's fine. I don't know if he himself said that, but that was the reason. So the Stoics all said this. Epictetus, too, in one of the discourses, is asked by his students, Master, are you a sage? And his answer is pretty much like, well, better think twice about that, because I'm sure as hell not a sage. I'm trying, but I'm not there. So again, very humble. And you really have to, I think, appreciate that moment, because Epicurus, the founder of the Epicurean school, said, I'm a sage, I am enlightened, I am wise, I will teach you how it's done, which is why that is called Epicureanism, named after him, and not Gardenism, even though he taught in a garden. So his students even had to remember his birthday, and they had to memorize some of his sayings. So he was, it sounds negative, but a bit fuller of himself than I think the Stoics were. Now the real question is, okay, that's all great, but does that mean that pardon me, but that we're all screwed. Because I mean, if none of us can be sages, then what? Then what's the point? Why would you? What is the point of wisdom and courage and all that other stuff and detachment and assent and all that dichotomy of control if you're not a sage anyway? Well, the Stoics have, in my mind, a very comforting answer to that, because they say it doesn't really matter as long as you try. If you genuinely try to be a good person, to be a sage, then you make progress. The Greek word for that is prokopsis, and that's a very important term in Stoicism, because the Stoic says, listen, buddy, forget about it, you'll never be a sage, but you can try. And if you sincerely strive, that's good enough, because you will start to make progress. And progress, I won't say is all it takes, but it is good enough. Okay, so then that's this I think is the final thing I can say about this, because I want to make sure that we really understand what a sage is, right? In the mind of a Stoic, a sage is a person who I would say has two very important properties. One is what we already talked about, apatheia, someone who is not disturbed by the passions. So a sage could be startled by something. Walking down the street, suddenly hears a loud bang. The sage will kind of startle as well. But a sage will then say about what's really going on. It's probably nothing. There's no reason for me to be worried about this. The second important property that a sage has is ataraxia. And ataraxia is something like tranquility, imperturbedness, someone who is not really bothered by what's going on in life. A sage accepts things the way they are and is fine with that. So is not led astray by passions, is not therefore susceptible to anxiety or depression or suffering, because he reasons or she reasons perfectly, right, completely rationally, sort of following the universe. If the universe or the logos, the ratio or God, whatever, puts this on your path, you go along with it. You don't seek those things that are not within your control, all of those things. And important to realize, a sage does experience emotions, right? To dispel that stereotype, even a Stoic sage would not be free of emotions, because that would be inhumane, because then you're a machine, right? A sage will experience emotions, but I guess this is a matter of, I have to paraphrase, but I'm sure you can correct me. There's a time to laugh, there's a time to cry, there's a time to dance, there's a time to mourn. It's pretty much that, right? It's all
Temperance.
there. Yes, exactly. And you just need to know when to do what thing. And a sage, a Stoic would say, well, a sage will know this, right? So all a Stoic sage will really do is sort of eradicate irrational judgments about emotions, and therefore not really experience negative passions, big sort of emotions on steroids of frustration or anger or these kinds of things. I think that is important. And of course, I don't know if it's of course, but you could, I suppose, make the point or try to defend the argument. I'm not saying that I have all the arguments, but you could say, well, if you're looking at sages, if you are looking at people to emulate, if you are looking at someone who sounds pretty enlightened, well, then if you look in the context of the New Testament and a character like Jesus comes to mind, right, says, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but like says all the right things, says wise things, right, is definitely temperate, is to seek justice, does all these things. So I wouldn't find it particularly strange to see a link with Stoicism and a person like that, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember, like you were saying, the Stoics say that it's at least you tried, or whatever, right? You don't have to be perfect, yes, like I say, but you got to at least try, right?
Yes.
And you hear a lot of Christians say that nowadays, but in the Bible, I think it says like the pure in heart will see God. And I remember going through this school of kingdom living, and this pastor was basically being, well, that just means have a pure motive. So to be pure in heart is to have a pure motive. And that's exactly what you're saying with Stoicism is the pure in heart. And of course, there's a lot of little details that you pick up as you read these books, which just makes more and more sense to me as I go. So, is there anything else you want to say before I just jump into the PowerPoint?
No. I think that's a very interesting point, and I think that ties in very well with the idea of you may not be in control of the things that happen to you in life, but you are in control of your responses to it, and you are also in control of your intentions. And that is a very important point that the Stoics make. They say, look, a very quick example, Epictetus gives the illustration of, he says, imagine you have a lute player, or lyre. I think it's a lyre player, actually. Someone who plays the lyre and accompanies himself singing, right? He gives that example. I always thought that was a very good illustration of this point. He says this person will sit by himself in his living room, so to speak, play his lyre and sing, and will do beautifully, right? But then he walks onto the stage, and all of a sudden he gets nervous and he doesn't play so well anymore. Why is that? And Epictetus says, because his intention is wrong. In his living room, his intention was just to play and sing. But once he walks onto the stage, his intention is to sing and play well and to garner applause. But that is not within his control, is it? You can do what you can to play as well as you can, to practice your playing and your singing, but whether people like you, that's not in your control. So there again, it is your desire, right?
You know, as a performer, that's huge. That's
and again, realize how important that is. It's just about your intention. You're not in control of the applause, but you are always in control of your intention. What it is you choose to do, believe, say, act upon, etc. Right?
Hey, before you move on to the PowerPoint, Kevin, can I say a couple things I took note of?
Sure.
So first off, what came first? Was it Stoicism or Buddhism? Because
that's a really good question. I am not 100% sure. A very good question, because
they sound very much alike in their discipline.
There are many parallels, and I don't think it is unreasonable to think, for example, that Stoicism kind of made its way out there because, I mean, people traveled around, and that it has maybe influenced Buddhism. I am not too sure about Buddhism influencing Stoicism, but I would be very hesitant to really give a clear answer on that. It is for sure an obvious parallel.
I used to think that... Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
Well, I'll just say my guess from the books I've read, but I think it was in the Pagan Christ that talks about how there's stuff from Buddhism. I think it was in the 5th century BC that was put into the Bible. But then again, Buddhism comes from those Vedic texts, which go back to India from like 3,000, 2,000, or is it 1,000 BC? So all roads seem to kind of go back to India in some cases. But I don't know.
I did used to think that, now I'm not even too sure Jesus, of the Bible, was a literal, actual, person. But when I did, I used to believe that from the ages of 13 to 30, when he was not written about at all, that perhaps he traveled and somehow got some Buddhist teaching, and that's why when he's preaching, it sounds a lot like what Buddhism also says. But now I'm kind of thinking it could be Stoicism too, though. I mean, it sounds more like Stoicism than Buddhism to me, because Buddhism is, well, it's not a religion, but it's in its practice, it seems more religious.
And I think one thing that is interesting is that I cannot claim to be an expert on Buddhism, but what I read about that is that I think one thing that is important, and again, I could be utterly wrong, so do feel free to correct me or whatever, but I always get that feeling that Buddhism, at least certain, because of course there are many forms and branches of Buddhism, but certainly if you look at the Japanese types of Buddhism, for example, it seems to me to be very focused on kind of it's not about you, you know, like it's kind of, you kind of extirpate yourself a little bit, like you're just, you are not important. And Stoics would not necessarily say that. So I think that's an important difference. Stoics would say, you know what, if you like Seneca was a billionaire, but no Stoic would say, well, that's wrong. They would just say, yeah, money is an indifferent. He just got lucky.
And see, Buddhism says that the only way to not suffer, the only way to get rid of suffering is to not have desires. And I don't think that's what Stoicism is necessarily saying. It's saying you can have desires just with temperance, right?
You could have desires as long as you do not desire things that are outside of your control, because then you will
desire virtue, not vice. And and also so the last thing is a little bit of just the way I think. So when you first explained Stoic physics, something kind of went off in my mind, but here was the thought: how can you not go along with what the universe is doing if you believe, according to Stoic physics, that everything is predetermined and repeats?
Yes, so, that is a fantastic question, because this ties into Stoics, on the one hand, say everything is determined. It's determinist philosophy, because they say the universe is a living, rational creature that basically determines everything. So whether you equate that with fate or a logos or God or whatever, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the universe is this sort of rational creature. So that means that everything is determined. Everything is determined by that rational power. Okay, if everything is determined, then what's all this stuff about things within your control and outside your control about them? Because if everything is determined, how can you have any control, right? And there's a famous quote, actually, by Diogenes Laertius, the guy who wrote about all these philosophers, who mentions, I can sort of reproduce it, but his quote is, I think, too good not to share, because I always found it comical. So Diogenes writes about Zeno. So this is the Zeno, the founder of the school, supposedly the Stoic, who is maybe not a sage, but kind of knows how to keep his cool. And Diogenes writes, we are told that once he, so Zeno, was beating a slave who had been accused of stealing. And the slave, this is my words, but I mean, this slave was not an idiot. He knew a little bit about his master's teachings. So he says, but I was fated to steal. To which Zeno replied, yes, and to be beaten. Right? So that's kind of a nice, well, that's tough luck then. So how does it work? Well, if you want to get really technical about that, Stoicism is a type of compatibilism, which is actually very difficult in my mind, to me as a non-philosopher. I find that difficult to understand, but it kind of boils down to, yes, everything may be determined, but that doesn't mean you don't have a responsibility. So if you are, let's say that ancient Greece, right? So let's say that you are some brigand and you decide to slit someone's throat in the road and you take his money, right? Stoics would say, look, the universe may have fated you to do that, but you still pulled that knife across someone's throat, so you're still responsible. Whether you were determined to do it or not, it doesn't really matter. You should still be held accountable. That is how I understand compatibilism. So it's interesting, but it is complicated. And this is something that many of the opponents of Stoicism at the time also said, like, look, this doesn't really make sense, guys. You can't be in control and have everything determined. Like, it's kind of got to be one or the other. So that is a complicated question, and I cannot say that I have the answer beyond things may be determined, but that doesn't mean you're sort of freed of all your responsibility.
I just mean, all I mean is there's no way to know if that's even true or not. So the best thing to do is to go by the virtues anyway.
Yeah, that is a very I would say, a perfect Stoic answer, because that's what a Stoic would say. Like, listen,
Yep.
if you
Under
always do the
control.
right thing, then you're safe, right? But it has to be the right thing.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I'll jump into my PowerPoint. I want to show some of my point parallels I saw, just for the visual learners who like the picture a bit better. Stoicism and the Bible. So this was just something I put together quickly today and last night, and it's only 9 slides, so it's not going to carry on too long, I hope. But yeah, just stuff I saw in comparison when it just popped into my head when I saw this. So comparing Stoicism to the Bible, page 50 of most of this is the Enchiridion. He says, contentment is a great delight, and the road is short. And then in the Bible it says, godliness with contentment is a great gain. 1 Timothy 6:6. And then he says, truth is immortal. I actually want to read that because he says something else there. So this was a cool one. He says, truth is a thing immortal and perpetual, and it gives to us a beauty which fades not away in time, nor does it take away the freedom of speech which proceeds from justice, but it gives to us the knowledge of what is just and lawful, separating from the unjust and refuting them. So it actually is separating or judging or leading what is just and unjust, or good and evil, you could say. So in a sense, this is like Libran on the scales. This is Libra on the scales of justice, and this is truth's job, is to discern good and evil. And we find that this is when the Feast of Trumpets happen, etc., in the Jewish religion, which would correspond to all those things. And then you have Jesus in the Bible. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And of course, he's called the Word of God, or the Logos. So, of course, you're using Logos, or ratio, which is rationality. And in this other book I read, it says that, yeah, the word Logos actually better word for it is ratio, which is both mathematical and means what we have for rationality and logic. And so Jesus, I think he's almost best understood as a metaphor for truth, if you're going to compare it to Stoicism. Again, truth dies and it rises, right? An old paradigm, we believe something was true, it'll go in, and we go through a time of learning something new, and that old truth dies, and a few days later it's new, it's made new, all things are made new, and it's like the cycle's repeating again. And then, of course, we have Stoicism is, of course, practice for everyday living, and then we have all scripture is useful for godliness, or at least in Timothy, he's basically saying that you should only listen to the people who are talking about godliness, which is, and then he even uses the word divine nature in 2 Peter, I think it's chapter 3, or maybe it's chapter 1. And of course, that's the word Cicero uses, is the divine nature of the gods, when he's writing about Stoicism, I think. And on page 40, we have basically this theme of being unmoved by the multitudes of people, right? In the Bible, you have Jesus never being swayed by the multitudes. He's hiding from the crowds. And even in Romans, it says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, which is actually a better translation is this age, because it's to do with time. But can move on. So spiritual slavery is an idea in both of them. And then we have death daily in your mind. So you should face death daily, keep it daily on your mind. Paul faces death daily. And Marcus Aurelius, I read 3 times, talks about the God in you in 3 pages. And in the Bible, of course, you have the kingdom of God within you and Christ in you. Nothing without purpose. In Marcus Aurelius, page 74, Paul is intensely purposeful in Philippians 3:14. Basically, of the worship of reason in Marcus Aurelius, he actually says that. And Paul is constantly using reason, and of course, Jesus is the Logos. And then I just wanted to point out something we should all be reminded of is how did Jesus actually say to discern the truth? And this is, of course, by their fruit. And of course, the fruit is a metaphor for the ethics. And if understood, the truth is being taught by Christ. He's the gospel, right? Truth is immortal and perpetual. This is what I read before. And then there was this interesting Facebook post I saw this week, which was kind of a synchronicity with what I was planning. But this was actually from a book of one of the authors we've had on our podcast. I think it talks about the days of the church father Origen. And the pagan philosopher Celsus criticized Christians for passing off the Jesus story as a new revelation, when it was actually an inferior imitation of pagan myths. He asks, are these distinctive happenings unique to the Christians? If so, how are they unique? And of course, they're all like the myths. And what do the Christians give? Well, the truth is there's nothing unusual about the Christians believe except that they believe it to the exclusion of more comprehensive truths about God. Celsus is right to be critical of Christian claims that Jesus' teachings are original and distinctive. Jesus teaches, lay up your treasure in heaven where no thief can get it. Sextus likewise exhorts, possess those things which no one can take away from you. Jesus is the king of the world because he is wise, not because he's powerful. The popular Stoic maxim was the only true king is the wise man. Jesus teaches, keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come. Epictetus writes, go not far from the ship at any time, lest the master should call and thou not be ready. Jesus teaches, I assure you, anyone who doesn't receive the kingdom of God is like a little child, will never get into it. Heraclitus writes, the kingdom belongs to the child. Jesus teaches, why do you call me good? No one is good, only God. 4 centuries previously, Plato had defined God as the good, the quality by which, by definition, only God could fully manifest. In a similar fashion to Jesus, Pythagoras had refused to be called wise, explaining no one was wise except God. Pythagoras preferred to call himself lover of wisdom or philosopher, a term he was the first person to use. So this is from Timothy Freak. The Jesus Mysteries was the original Jesus, a pagan god. So that's basically the end of my, well, I got one more slide here. And this was the idea I think you gave first time I heard your presentation at Phil's. But this is the order I would put the 3 Stoa in. I would actually start with the roots, which would be the physics, because that seems to correspond to Judaism. If you read it, Romans 11:18, it says, do not be arrogant towards the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. So you have this kind of picture of the Jews are the root, or they're the firstborn, right? And the firstborn of the Old Testament is supporting the New Testament. And of course, the Logos, or the logic, would be second, because that's Christ, the mediator between the 2 covenants. And then the last would be the ethics, or the fruit of the Spirit, which is the ethics. So, and that's basically the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or the tree of life, in a sense.
Yeah.
And that's the end of the slide. I just have a quote here from Cicero talking about reason. Reason is superior to that which does not. Nothing is superior to the world. The world therefore reasons. By the same rule, the world may be proved to be wise, happy, and eternal, for the possession of all these qualities is superior to the want of them. So I thought that was interesting, comparing it to Cicero. And I can stop that. share.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
That is interesting.
Yeah. So what do you have any thoughts about what you saw there?
Well, yeah, I think no. I definitely think it's very interesting to look at these kinds of parallels, and I do think that there is quite a lot in Christian teachings that a Stoic would be able to accept.
Yeah.
And in a way, I mean, if you to give one concrete example, I mean, I think there is some passages in Epictetus's discourses, for example, which are very much along the lines of turn the other cheek. Like, well, look, if something happens to you, yeah, well, what do you expect? It's happening to you. You can get upset about it, or you can just accept it, which sounds a bit like turning the other cheek to me. So I think there are some interesting parallels. And another thing that I think is interesting is that, and that's kind of why I was harping on about this whole issue of you can call it what you like in Stoic terms, whether you use the universe or divine providence or nature or the cosmos or the logos or God, which are, I'm pretty sure, all terms that Stoics use at one point or another.
Right.
So in a way, it doesn't even really matter whether you have a religious denomination or whether you do not. I still think that at least a number of the principles, if not all of the principles that Stoicism is founded on, you can still kind of get behind. And the other way around too, like a Stoic, I don't think a Stoic would object to anyone. I mean, this, of course, the Stoa doesn't exist anymore, but if it would still exist, I don't think the Stoics would object if you would come in as a Christian or as someone in the Jewish religion or as a Buddhist or whatever, because they don't care. It doesn't really matter what you believe in. It matters in how you apply those principles to make your life better, with, of course, the ultimate goal of, if everyone would do that, the world might be better.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I find it interesting comparing it to Christianity, because Christianity is this religion that's about bettering yourself in some moral sense. But even the history, I did some research on like Vespasian. Some of the emperors were actually against Stoicism and some were for Stoicism. And Vespasian was actually against Stoicism, which is interesting because Vespasian and Titus seem to actually fulfill the second coming of Christ from like Matthew 24. So they probably would have wanted people to take these myths more literally, whereas the Stoics are actually giving this explanation of it. So it's almost like some emperors are trying to hide some of this stuff for the sake of the mythological view, or maybe they believe the mythological view as literal. And then there's I don't know.
I think it's also, you could also say, if you are a Roman emperor, and Marcus Aurelius was considered to be, I think, the last or one of the last of what they call the five good Roman emperors, the ones who were not absolutely mad as a snake, which many of them were. Nero was insane, and a lot of them were. So if you are not one of the quote-unquote good emperors, I can imagine that the idea of having teachers in your country, or even worse, in your city, who are teaching people how to think for themselves, how to think about life, that might make you a little nervous, because once people start to question your divine status or your absolute power, things can become a little nasty for you, right? So I can see how an emperor would say, you know what, all philosophers get out, which is indeed what happened to Epictetus, which is why he had to leave Rome, and also to Rufus, by the way, who also got banished once. So did Seneca. So I mean, so I don't know. That means that if you are a Stoic, at some point you're on the risk of getting banished. But in any case, it is a thing, right? It is a thing, and it's something to be aware of. Yeah.
So, last question. I was just wondering, what's your favorite book on Stoicism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think there are two ways to answer that, because on the one hand, of course, you have a primary Stoic source, right? And most of that would be, as I said, Seneca or Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus or Rufus. But Musonius Rufus's book, the translation of his lectures and the fragments we have is like this thick. That's a tiny little book, because there aren't that many things left.
Right.
So if the answer is you have to pick one, what's your favorite Stoic author? I really like Epictetus. I read all the discourses, but what I really like is the Enchiridion, because it is so short. And the nice thing is, some of these, I would say, as a typical professor does, Epictetus sometimes seems to kind of lose himself what he's talking about. I mean, I'm not saying that he's not coherent, but it's a very long story, and I think you could have said that in 10 lines or something. Right. But that's his nature, and that's also because at that time he didn't necessarily have a lecture plan, but someone came in and said, "Hey, Epictetus, what do I do about my brother who doesn't like me?" And then he would have to respond to that, because that's what it was like. So I think the Enchiridion is nice because it is so brief and concise. And if people want to get started on Stoicism, I think that is an excellent place to start, because it's very legible. Unlike Marcus Aurelius, who sometimes says really weird, vague things, Epictetus is kind of down to earth, is very clear, especially the Enchiridion. So that would be my choice for a primary source. When it comes to books about Stoicism, for example, from, let's say, a more modern author, there is a plethora to choose from. But one book that I found very interesting and very legible and very nice is called How to Be a Stoic, by Massimo Pigliucci, who has no less than 3 PhDs, including one in philosophy. But he has a very pleasant, legible writing style. And what is nice about him is that he talks about pretty much everything we talked about today: the action, the assent, the control, all that stuff. But he kind of presents it a little bit as a dialogue with Epictetus. So it's not, the whole book is not a dialogue, but he talks a bit about what Epictetus wrote, and then he talks about his own personal thoughts about that. And then he talks about, now, if I would agree and especially disagree with this, what would Epictetus tell me in return? How would he refute what I'm trying to say? So it's a very interesting book. And if you kind of want to get started in Stoicism, I think that is a very interesting book to read, because it's so legible and because it's quite practical about what to do. So that's a very good one too. Okay, great. Yeah, well, thanks for coming on our show. Thanks for having me. Yeah, how can people contact you? Or, the easiest way is probably to send me an email. I happen to have 4 first names, which is not very Stoic, because you would be probably a bit more minimalist. But in any case, my 4 initials are S for Stephen, B for Brendan, R for Ronald, and E for Eric. If you put those together, you get SBRE. If you add my last name to that, Brown, just Brown without E at the end, just like the color, at gmail.com is my email address. I also have sbrebrown.com as my website, which also has a contact form, so you can use that to contact me. Okay, great. Well, yeah, like I said, thanks for having us. Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun. And yeah, hopefully we can maybe do it again, or we'll see what happens in the future. For sure. All right. Bye, guys. Bye.